In 1792, fights broke out on the streets of New York, with gangs of men beating each other up with both their fists and clubs. One fight got so intense that guns ended up being drawn. Thankfully, pistols in the 1790s were inaccurate enough for them to completely miss their targets, with everyone eventually going home, bruised and battered, but alive. With all this being the result of the recent disputed election for governor of New York between George Clinton and his challenger, John Jay, with the supporters of Jay accusing Clinton of stealing the election, while the supporters of Clinton accused Jay of corruption. Now it's important to put this election into greater context, as this was just 3 years after the US Constitution had been ratified in 1788, and during this time, many Americans were still getting used to voting and being part of this democratic process, with each local state constitution also testing out different methods by which the state governors would be elected and what powers they would have. For example, while many states in the South had governors that were appointed office by their local legislatures, according to the New York State Constitution of 1777, the governors of the state had to be elected by the public, with the challenger, John Jay, notably being one of the main authors of this constitution. Now it's important to note that in the early days of America, there are many more qualifications and limitations on who was allowed to participate in politics by voting and running for office, with both these categories largely being limited to land-owning white men, with these racial and land-owning distinctions being important in states like New York, as during this time, slavery was still in place. And during the 1792 election, both candidates for governor came from slave-owning families, with the state only beginning to gradually free the enslaved population, starting in 1799, with this process not being fully complete until 1827, when slavery was fully abolished in New York State. Now in the 1790s, New York was one of the largest and most important centers of trade in the US, with the American political landscape largely being divided into two main camps, with there being the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, and the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, with the main differences between the two being that while the Democratic Republicans wanted stronger state governments and were more focused on growing America through promoting agriculture, the Federalists supported a stronger federal government and were focused on growing American industry through business and trade. Now these were not minor political differences, as each side generally saw the other as basically being traitors to the spirit of the American Revolution and the new US Constitution. They even openly attacked each other in the press by supporting rival newspapers. For example, Hamilton had the Gazette of the United States, while Jefferson had the National Gazette. Now these differences caused divisions to emerge between many former allies and friends, with those once united during the Revolution soon taking sides against each other. George Clinton, a veteran of the French and Indian War and a general during the Revolution, openly opposed ratifying the US Constitution and criticized his new federal government as being too powerful. Meanwhile, John Jay, a diplomat and delegate to the Continental Congress, took the opposing view, with Jay being one of the three authors of the Federalist Papers, along with Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, with the papers calling for the people of New York to unite behind the US Constitution. Unfortunately, just a few years later, even these three authors began to grow apart, with Madison going on to side with Clinton and becoming a leader of the Democratic Republicans, while Jay and Hamilton would go on to lead the Federalists. Now by 1792, George Clinton had been serving as governor of New York for almost 15 years after first being elected in 1777, with Clinton using his reputation as a soldier during the Revolutionary War and the spoils system to become one of the leading political figures in New York during the late 1700s, with the spoils system being when people will be rewarded with land, government jobs, and favors in exchange for their political support. During the same time, Jay had been appointed by George Washington to be the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. However, Jay had accepted this nomination to run for governor, largely because he wanted a reason to leave the court and return home to his family, as he was tired of riding circuit. This because, while today, the Supreme Court justices go into work at one large building in Washington, D.C. from 1789 to 1912, each justice had an additional job in the United States Circuit Courts, which required them to ride circuit, or travel around the largely rural and dangerous American countryside, hearing cases for about 6 to 9 months out of the year. And as this was still the 1700s, the constant travel was exhausting, as the justices had to be away from their friends and family for several months, with several justices making reports about becoming depressed, being lonely, falling ill, or even being robbed while traveling, with Jay hoping to be elected so he could return home to New York and remain close to his wife and children. Now, as a great man once said, even old New York was once New Amsterdam. In addition to politics, many of these early electoral battles were also the result of decades-long conflicts between the old Dutch-American political families of the state, with several prominent Dutch families coming to own large estates throughout the Hudson River Valley. Some families, such as the Van Renslers, who controlled an area of land that was somewhere between 700 and 850,000 acres around the city of Albany, were even able to gain patroonships during the Dutch colonial period, with the patroon system allowing the Renslers to basically act as feudal lords. Here, they were able to control the local economy and issue rents that would last for several generations. And the tenants on their lands owed the patroons not just rent, but they also had to work for him for free for a few days each year, and provide them with goods such as wood, wheat, and butter. And in the early days, in order to enforce this arrangement, the patroons were even allowed to create their own legal system, with local lawyers, judges, and law courts, all of whom answered to the patroon. Now, while the patroon courts largely disappeared by the early 1700s, even with American independence in 1776, owning a patroonship allowed members of these Dutch families to become very powerful and very wealthy. This would include figures such as Stephen Van Rensselaer III, who was one of the richest men in the United States during the 1790s. Patroons like him used their influence to control their tenants' voting patterns by encouraging them to vote as a bloc for their preferred candidates, with Stephen being a firm Federalist and one of John Jay's most important supporters. The other major player in New York politics during this time was Alexander Hamilton, a founding father, the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, and Stephen's brother-in-law, with both of these men having married the daughters of Senator Philip Schuyler, with Schuyler's wife, Catherine von Rensselaer, also being a distant relative of Stephen's. Now, one example of an early dispute between these families can be seen in Schuyler's attempt to be re-elected to the Senate in 1791. He lost the nomination after he was challenged by the Attorney General of New York, Aaron Burr, who had the support of the rival Livingston and Clinton families. This upset Alexander Hamilton, who wanted his father-in-law to be in the Senate so he could get more support for his economic policies, with this dispute causing the rivalry between Hamilton and Burr to worsen, with this feud eventually leading to the famous duel in 1804, which would end the life of Alexander Hamilton and the political career of Aaron Burr. Now, George Clinton was not born into this Dutch-American elite. He was the son of Scots-Irish immigrants who claimed to be relatives of the noble Clinton family that held the title of Earl of Lincoln, with one member of the family who was also named George Clinton also being a governor of New York. However, he was governor when the territory was still a colony under the British, but Clinton was able to rise up and make an advantageous marriage to Cornelia Tappan, who did come from a prominent Dutch family. And during the governor's election in 1792, Clinton was notably supported by the Democratic-Republican branch of the Livingston family. And although the Livingston family was originally Scottish, back in the 1600s, they had moved first to the Netherlands and then to New Amsterdam, the family integrating with the local Dutch community by learning the Dutch language and becoming part of the Dutch Reformed Church. This led to some personal tensions with John Jay, as he was married to Sarah Livingston, with a notable political opponent of Jay's being his own brother-in-law, Henry. This must have been very difficult for Jay, as he and Henry were quite close in the past, with Henry once having been Jay's private secretary during the Revolutionary War. And while the paternal line of the Jay family originated from France, John Jay was related to the local Dutch-American elite thanks to his mother and grandmother. Jay's French grandfather, Augustus, a successful merchant, had married Anna Bayard, who was the great niece of the last Dutch leader of New Netherlands, Peter Stuyvesant. She was also a granddaughter of Govert Lockermans, who was one of the richest men in the colony during the 1600s. And John Jay's mother, Mary van Corteland, belonged to another prominent Dutch family that produced many notable businessmen and local politicians. This would include some of the earliest mayors of New York City, with the family even claiming to have popularized the Santa Claus tradition in America by adapting the figure of Sinterklaas, which is a local Dutch version of St. Nicholas. Now, this connection even led Jay to be a distant relative of Pierre van Corteland, who was George Clinton's longtime lieutenant governor. And almost a decade later, George's daughter, Catherine Clinton, would go on to marry Pierre's son, leading these three families to be drawn even closer together. So now you can see how even though political differences played an important part in these early New York elections, the role of personal conflicts and family relationships was also very, very important. Now, if you liked the video so far, make sure to like and subscribe, and if you want to support the channel even further, consider becoming a YouTube member or supporting the channel on Patreon, with both these perks providing you with more access to content. Now, as noted earlier, during the 1790s, voting was largely limited to land-owning white men. The requirements of the 1777 New York State Constitution, outlining that in order to vote in the local state assembly, you had to be a grown man, live in the area for at least 6 months before the election, and own property worth at least 400 shillings, or pay a yearly rent of at least 40 shillings. And if someone wanted to vote for a state senator, or for the governor, they had to be a grown man and own property worth at least 2,000 shillings. Now, to put this into some perspective, female servants during this time made about 5 shillings a week, and laborers made about 4 shillings a day, with there only being about 17,000 total voters in the governor's race, out of a New York State population of about 340,000 people. And in addition to this, in 1787, a local law was passed that outlined how elections were supposed to be held in the state. During election time, the votes of each county had to be gathered by the county sheriff, who would then seal them into boxes, which would then be delivered to the New York Secretary of State in New York City. The votes would then be counted by a 12-member canvassing committee, with half of the members being from the state Senate, while the other half came from the state Assembly, with the local New York Senate sending 3 Federalists and 3 Democratic Republicans, while the state Assembly sent 6 Democratic Republicans. This gave the Democratic Republicans a solid 9-3 majority on the committee. And during the 1792 election, issues came up in at least 3 counties, with all of them just happening to be strongholds of the Federalist Party. In Tioga, Clinton, and Otsego counties, concerns were raised about the local sheriffs not properly following the 1787 law. For example, the issue in Otsego County was that the local sheriff, Robert Smith's term had ended before the election began. Therefore, he wasn't legally the sheriff, and as a result, none of the county votes he sent could legally be counted, with the canvassing committee going on to vote 7-4 to reject the ballots from all 3 counties. Now, since they were following the 1787 law, this should have been fine. However, this was an extremely close election, and as a result of throwing out the votes for these 3 counties, it put George Clinton in the lead to be the next governor by only a few hundred votes. And by throwing out the votes from a heavily Federalist area, it meant that if those votes were kept, John Jay probably would have won the election instead, meaning that the canvassing committee's decision to throw out the votes directly contributed to Clinton being elected. Things became even more contentious when people learned that the votes from Otsego County ended up being burned after they were rejected, and that the 7-4 split of the canvassing committee was largely broken down by partisan lines, with the 7 all being supporters of Clinton, while the 4 in opposition included 3 supporters of John Jay and 1 Clinton supporter who flipped. This decision also only included 11 of the 12 committee members because the last Clinton supporter just happened to miss the final vote. As a result of this, many Federalists protested the results of the election and the actions of the committee because they saw it as a corrupt way for the Democratic Republicans to manipulate the existing election laws to have their candidate win, while the Democratic Republicans defended themselves by saying that they were simply following the 1787 law and that the main issue was that the Federalists had failed to follow the accepted election procedures. Now, it's important to acknowledge that while the Democratic Republicans definitely used this controversy as an opportunity to get their candidate elected, it is also important to ask, were they right to have concerns about the votes being manipulated, and were the elections in Otsego County fair to begin with? Now, as we know, much of New York's politics were influenced by the wealthy landowners in the state, and Otsego was no different, with much of the county's politics being dominated by Federalist ally William Cooper, who founded the county seat of Cooperstown, with the local sheriff, Robert Smith, actually being a close friend of Cooper's. In fact, during the election, Smith illegally held 2 offices. First, as a town supervisor, where he was able to run the election, and second, as a sheriff, where he was able to seal and ship the votes to the Secretary of State. And when this was discovered, it made people worry that Cooper could have manipulated the votes in the county in favor of the Federalists, even though there wasn't any hard evidence of this actually happening, with people growing even more suspicious when they found that the votes had been stored at a shop co-owned by Cooper and Smith, before they were handed off to another Federalist ally to be brought to New York City, with it also being discovered that several Federalists had actually been involved in a scheme to illegally keep Smith as sheriff for the 1792 governor's election. This because when Smith's term as sheriff ended, the Democratic-Republican dominated Appointments Committee picked a new man named Benjamin Gilbert to replace him, with Gilbert actually being confirmed before the 1792 election began. But since this was the 1700s, it took a few days for Gilbert to get the news, and then travel to Cooperstown to start his new job. Someone from the committee therefore had to make sure the news got to Gilbert, with one of the few Federalists on the committee personally volunteering to let Gilbert know. This is John Jay ally, Stephen Van Rensselaer III. However, instead of going to Gilbert directly, he chose to bring the news to William Cooper instead, and told him not to let Gilbert know he was sheriff until the election was already over. This because Stephen was also a candidate in that election as John Jay's lieutenant governor, and he was worried that a Democratic-Republican appointed sheriff might try to manipulate the votes of the largely Federalist Otsego County. However, the plan ended up backfiring and contributed to the Federalists losing the election, as Robert Smith illegally continuing to be sheriff is what led the county's votes to be rejected. Now, after Clinton was re-elected as governor, later in the year, he ended up being nominated as the Democratic-Republican's choice for vice president. This because while both political factions during this time supported George Washington being re-elected as president, the Democratic Republicans were largely unhappy with Vice President John Adams and saw Clinton as the best option to defeat him. However, as a result of the recent governor's election scandal, people also began to look for other options for VP, with one notable choice being Aaron Burr, who is currently the senator from New York, with another concern being that if Clinton was elected vice president, he would have to leave the office of governor. However, during election time, even though Burr, Clinton, and even Thomas Jefferson got some electoral votes, John Adams ended up being re-elected as vice president. Now, after having failed to become governor, John Jay would go on to negotiate a treaty with the British, in the hopes of improving relations between the US and their former colonial power. But when the terms of the Jay Treaty were eventually agreed upon in 1794, it became very unpopular with the American public, and many politicians such as Thomas Jefferson, who wished to form closer ties with revolutionary France. People even began protesting the act by taking to the streets and burning the British flag, images of John Jay, and copies of the treaty, with this pro-British versus pro-French sentiment largely falling along party lines, with the Federalists supporting the new treaty, while the Democratic Republicans opposed it. Now, Clinton continued to serve as governor of New York until 1795, and when he chose not to run for governor again, the Federalists were finally able to get their candidates elected, with John Jay and Stephen Van Rensselaer finally becoming governor and lieutenant governor, with John Jay going on to defeat Robert Livingston, a distant relative of his wife, during the 1798 election. And after his term ended in 1801, despite a confirmation to return to the Supreme Court as Chief Justice, Jay chose to retire from politics and decided to spend time with his family instead, with Stephen going on to be the Federalist nominee for governor in 1801. However, this time George Clinton returned and ran for governor again. Notably, Clinton's lieutenant governor during this time, Jeremiah Van Rensselaer, was a distant relative of Stephen's, as well as his uncle by marriage. Now, despite being in declining health, Clinton would go on to continue his rise in politics by being elected vice president, first in 1804 under Thomas Jefferson, and then in 1808 under James Madison, with Clinton largely passing the reins of power in New York politics to his nephew, DeWitt Clinton, who would serve as senator, mayor of New York City, lieutenant governor, and eventually governor of the state. Now, despite his bad health and old age, Clinton hoped to succeed Thomas Jefferson as president in 1808. However, the Democratic Republicans decided to nominate the younger James Madison instead, with Clinton being kept on as vice president. As a result of this dispute, Clinton had a fallout with Madison, leading the vice president to now side with the opponents of the president. For example, even though Madison's administration wanted to recharter the Bank of the United States, when the vote ended up being tied in the Senate, Clinton broke that tie by voting against it. Eventually, George Clinton passed away in 1812 at the age of 72, being the first vice president to die in office. Meanwhile, John Jay would go on to spend almost 30 years in retirement before passing away at the age of 83 in his library in 1892. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time. If you'd like to have early access and give feedback on this type of content, please consider becoming a YouTube member or joining the Patreon. And as always, thanks to my patrons Antroid, NMS, and DC. Thank you so much for the support you have given me so far.